Hi, my name is Tyler Mowry, and welcome to the Writer's Mind Podcast, episode 22. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. That is a quote from Albert Camus in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. Maybe you've heard of that quote. It's a fairly famous quote, but I want to talk a little bit about Albert Camus and what his philosophy was. So he was kind of the founder of this idea called absurdism. So absurdism kind of sits near nihilism. It's almost like a optimistic nihilism. Essentially, he was saying that the world is an absurd place. We can't know things for sure. And because we can't know things for sure, we must accept this absurdity of our situation and find beauty and value in our day-to-day lives. One of these things, or one of the interesting things that he said was, we build our life on the hope for tomorrow, yet tomorrow brings us closer to death, the ultimate enemy. Again, he was talking about how we set our lives up for the long term. We set our lives up and we look towards the future. We concern ourselves with what is happening next. We concern ourselves with where we're going, our legacy. And Camus really rejects these concepts, or at least he rejects them in the sense that they have inherent meaning. You know, his philosophy was based upon the idea that we have this constant conflict between the fact that the world is meaningless and we have this deep desire for meaning. And he said that absurdism essentially fills the gap between those two, where rather than ascribing large-scale meaning to the world and to ourselves, we simply take on personal meaning for the mundane, regular, average things that exist in our lives, and we take our lives for what they are and accept that and don't move forward. So he's a really interesting person. I think that his philosophy, his philosophy is the best point of view if you're going to take a nihilistic viewpoint, right? So, there are nihilists who are very, very cynical, very pessimistic, very much looking at the world in the sense of everything is chaos and useless and meaningless. Therefore, I am useless, I am meaningless, and we should all just sort of die. Or, we should not do anything of value, not do anything of importance, not try to find happiness, none of these things. So it's essentially there's a version of nihilism that's very defeatist in that way. Not all nihilists believe that, but it can really get to that kind of point. But Camus really presents this interesting kind of optimistic version of nihilism where he's saying, hey, because everything is so absurd, you should stop trying to find meaning in the absurdity and simply enjoy your existence, enjoy the present moment, enjoy your life. The things that you want to do them because you're trying to do them in this life, not because you're trying to prepare for what happens next or any of that. And I think it's a very interesting point of view. Another thing he says relating to the absurd is he says that true knowledge is impossible and rationality and science cannot explain the world. Their stories ultimately end in meaningless abstractions, in metaphors. This is the absurd condition. From the moment absurdity is recognized, it becomes a passion, the most harrowing of all. So what he's saying here is that we try to build meaning into our world. We try to identify true meaning, right? So we try to identify true meaning with, he's talking about science and rationality, which I think that in our current world, we would probably say that that's how we are trying to find meaning. We try to find it through science and through rationality, through these things that we believe are sort of concrete truths. But we also try to find them through different ideology. We try to find them through religion. We try to find them through political movements. And he is saying that all of these things are useless. We're not going to find the meaning that we're looking for. And we must build personal meaning to the different events in our lives. Now, one thing that he said, which I thought was really interesting, this right here, he's saying that rationality and science, their stories ultimately end in meaningless abstractions and metaphors, which is really interesting because what he's saying here is he's saying that rationality and science is creating stories just like religions are, or just like political movements are. He's saying that rationality and science is nothing but another ideology that a particular group of people follow that is telling a particular story. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. And I think that's true to a certain extent, that people put their faith in these different things, in what we know as, what we know scientifically, what we know mathematically, what we can conclude about our world and about existence. I think what's interesting is, I think through these sorts of concepts like rationality and science, I think what we tried to do is we tried to create the most clear-cut, concrete, what we can see equals ideology. And we tried to do that as much as we possibly could. And I think that what's interesting is we still see the same trappings of the human mind and human error in these sorts of ideas as we see in other ideological systems, right? So when you have science, you also have scientists, and scientists go into experiments. They go into things with bias, and then they start creating narratives about who we are, where we came from, all these sorts of things based upon what they think happened. And some of that is mixed in science, and then some of that is mixed in other elements. You have lobbying, you have different organizations funding different scientists, and they really want particular conclusions. Therefore, those conclusions get met because people are trying to get their projects funded. And so what's interesting is you have this whole element of just the reality of being a human involved in something that we are trying to say is fully 100% concrete, and we have really started to figure things out. And I think that there's a lot of things, it seems like, I think we try to look behind, we try to look in history, and we try to say, oh, look at these people, they believed these wild things. I can't imagine that they believe these things, but we have found the truth. We are people of science. We are people of rationality. We know, but they were the idiots, right? And I think that every civilization that's ever existed is thinking that, right? We're the ones. We did it. We figured it out. Those people, they had no idea what they were talking about, but we're the smart ones, and we got it. And I think that Camus is essentially saying that clearly that's not the case. That we consistently build these ideologies to ascribe meaning to the world, and he believes that it simply is not there. Now, do I believe Camus? Do I think he's correct? That's a good question. I think what's interesting is right now, I think I have to say no. I mean, I have not subscribed to his ideology. I do not believe that there is no inherent meaning in the world. I do think there is meaning, right? So clearly I have not placed myself into his worldview, his ideology. I think I got more thinking to do. But I think what he is talking about is very interesting. I mean, I think it seems to be a theory that makes a lot of sense, right? He's kind of taking these elements of our existence and saying, okay, how do we handle the fact that none of this works perfectly, that clearly all these different ideological systems and the civilization we have built for ourselves, right? Going to a job and riding in a car and all these sorts of things. How do we take them and say, okay, this is what, how do we synthesize them essentially? How do we make a synthesized ideology out of them? And, essentially he said, you can't. And that is the ideology is that you can't. Right. And I think that what's so fascinating is we're always in this struggle of trying to figure out what we actually believe and where is the meaning in life and where do we find that. What's interesting is I think he also talks about this. I don't have a quote written down from here, but he talks about how he kind of thinks that religions especially are convenient in the way that they give a fully built ideology that explains the world. And, his point of view is they don't truly do that, but they give a comfortable space to sit your mind so that you don't have to think about the fact that things seem actually meaningless and that there seems to be so much more going on than you realize. So, that's his point of view. What's interesting is there does seem to be, from my point of view, there does seem to be some legitimacy in that. I think that what I've seen is as I'm broadening my experiences and as I am broadening the reading I've done and talking to different people and having conversations and studying different ideologies and different worldviews, it definitely does seem like, once you start to break out of your own ideology or the place that you were born into, you start to realize that people are doing things very, very differently than you thought they were, right? You very much kind of think that the world is where you are, right? It's very easy to be in an ideology and be like, okay, the world works this way, and your entire bubble is the city that you're in or the state that you're in or the country that you're in, right? And then when you slowly expand that, you kind of realize, oh, people are doing radically different things. They have radically different beliefs. People are trying to handle radically different elements of how it seems like the world works. And so you end up with this broadened horizon. And I think that what that creates is this kind of question where you're like, well, it seems like everybody's kind of doing all these things that are different. They have all these different ideologies. So how do you actually synthesize something and find meaning and find the truth, the ultimate truth, if it exists? And Camus would say you're never going to. His book is The Myth of Sisyphus. And in the book, he talks about a Greek legend. I believe it's Greek, yeah. Or maybe it was Roman, I forget. But the point is, Sisyphus was this king, and he cheated death. He wanted to do everything, anything he wanted. He didn't want to die. He wanted to be alive forever. He had cheated death twice, I believe it was, and as punishment, Zeus, the king of the gods, punished him and put him in Hades and made him push a rock up a hill for all of eternity. So rather than killing Sisyphus and just bringing him death, because Sisyphus didn't want to die, so Sisyphus was saying, oh, my punishment can't just be death because I won't be punished enough. He was trying to get out of dying. The only thing he wanted to do was to not die. And so he was cursed to push this rock up this hill forever and ever and ever. And Camus is talking about that, and he's essentially saying that at least Sisyphus is alive. At least he gets the struggle. He gets the feeling of being alive. He's not going to die. What he wanted to do was to stay alive. He wanted to just be here. He didn't really want anything else. He wasn't trying to find ultimate meaning. He just wanted to be alive. He wanted to breathe air. He wanted to, walk around. He wanted to just feel things. And so that's what he gets. He gets this task, he gets this struggle of pushing this rock up this hill. And Camus believes that Sisyphus is happy. Because Sisyphus gets the feeling of pushing the rock up, right? He gets the feeling of air in his lungs. He gets the feeling of touching this rock and having the struggle. And he gets the feeling of walking down the hill after the rock rolls back down after he pushes it up. And he gets the feeling of just being alive. And Camus takes that idea and he says that this is how we should live. We should live just happy at the fact that we get to breathe air and we get to exist in this weird world that doesn't make any sense. And he's saying that the fact that we even get to exist in this weird world that makes no sense is everything that we need, and that we don't have to go out and search for meaning, and we don't have to create these ideologies. And I think that he lived that out, right? If you read about Camus, there's a lot of philosophers that are kind of people who sat in their houses and wrote, and they're kind of weird guys. There's definitely a lot of those, but Camus was out there living life. He was out there doing interesting things, and he just wanted to be alive. And so it's almost that his philosophy kind of came out of that desire to just be like, I don't want to look at these ideologies. I don't want to do these things. I just want to be alive and exist. And wherever I am in the world and whatever's going on, I just want to kind of do that. And so it's a very fun point of view, I think, right? I think it's very just fun. Now, what's interesting, right, is I think you can see this in certain religions where there are huge penalties or punishments for not subscribing to that particular worldview. So then you get into these different problems where, so let's say you're a Christian and if you're not a Christian, then you will go to hell, right? So it's like you can feel a desire not to fall into something like Camus' ideology, specifically because you believe that if you do something like this, you will go to hell, right? So what's interesting is you can look at a lot of major religions and these different ideologies have major punishments for not subscribing to that particular ideology. And that kind of, it's useful because it kind of keeps people within that ideology. And at the very least, it keeps people on the search for meaning, right? Because if you know that there are grave consequences to not figuring it out, then you will continue on that search for meaning. And I think that's really interesting because I think that I had that, the way I grew up, it was definitely like, if you do not subscribe to this particular ideology, there are grave existential consequences. And so, that thing I think really helped continue pushing me to be like, okay, what is meaning? What do I believe? What is out there? What am I supposed to be doing? And I think that's still there to this day. And it's a very funny kind of thing that sticks with you, right? Like you really get into the feeling of what if some of these sort of fun, and there's almost a whimsical nature to Camus' ideology, right? Because it's just kind of like, hey, it's all right. You can kind of just do whatever. And, it doesn't matter. You'll be fine. There's a very whimsical sort of consequence-free element to that. There's almost an idea, and this kind of goes back to the idea of like, is this something that I am intuiting as true, or is this something that is a remnant of an ideology I used to hold or still hold, which is like, but what if he's wrong? One, what if he's wrong? And two, is this truly the way that we should all live? Because I think what's interesting is if you take the single person and then you apply his ideology to everyone, does it work? Right? one of the things that was interesting about Camus is that he was focused on anything you want to do, anything you're trying to build, do it in your lifetime. Don't be looking towards what happens next or thinking super, super long term. And it's interesting to think about what would happen if we kind of all thought that way. Maybe it would be better. I don't know. But I think what's interesting is there's an idea that certain philosophies could almost break civilization, right? If everybody thought how Camus thought, why would anybody go to work? Or why would they try to work hard and advance in a career? And you can say, oh, well, what if all of that just doesn't matter at all? Like maybe we should just sort of pull the entire society down and stop doing what we're doing entirely. And so I think these sorts of things I think is very interesting. I think ultimately what Camus gives you is this idea of why are you doing what you're doing, right? What are you doing in your day-to-day life? Do you subscribe to an ideology? Do you have a clear meaning in your day-to-day life? Are you sort of just rolling through it and you also hate it and you're doing things you don't want to do and you're living a life that you don't want to live? And I think what he kind of does is he shakes you out of that sleep. And he says like, hey, you should think about what you want to do, because maybe what you believe in after this isn't there. Or maybe you are giving yourself all of this mental torment for something that isn't there. And maybe you should just go to the beach. And so I think it's such an interesting ideology. And I love the fact that he really lived it, like he really lived this sort of carefree ideology. And I think that, if you asked him on his last day of life, did this work for you? I think he would say, yeah, it did. And I really like watching people do that. I want people to, if you have a synthesized ideology like this, right, then you should be living that, right? You shouldn't be kind of halfway doing what you're doing and halfway doing that. That's kind of an issue with what you see in a lot of religions, where people kind of halfway do the thing. People kind of go here on, people will go to church on like Easter or Christmas, and that's kind of it. They're not like fully in this ideology, but they're also kind of hanging around because they think, oh, maybe this is probably real, so maybe I'll hang around the edges, And, I would say don't do that. I think you have to I think it's helpful if you choose what you're doing and you choose to say, okay, I'm done with this, or I'm moving on from this for now, or I'm going to stick with this. I'm going to go all in with this thing. And the fact that Camus really went all in with this idea that he's like, hey, I'm just going to do what I want to do. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to enjoy the mundane elements of life. And that's what I'm going to do. And I think I can respect anybody that actually takes their philosophy and takes their ideology and applies it to their life. I think we all need to be doing that. I think it's the only way to make any sort of quote unquote progress in our philosophical understanding. Obviously Camus would completely disagree with me with the idea that we could make progress in our philosophical understanding, but I think we might be able to. I'm not ready to give that up yet. I'm not ready to subscribe to his idea just yet. But I think it's very interesting, and I would really recommend you read the book. It can be a little dense, but it's definitely a fun read. So let me know what you thought of Camus' philosophy. I think it's really interesting. Talk to me in the Discord, and I will see you guys next week.